Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this video we're going to be going over 4 games in the Caro Kann Tartakower variation. One of them being from myself, and 3 of them being from some of you subscribers who have sent in Caro Kann games to me. I'm sure we can do more of these videos in other variations if you guys would like, but without actually asking for Tartakower games, about half of the games sent to me were in the Tartakower, so I thought I might as well make it dedicated to the Tartakower, and we have some great games to go over. So I'll be talking about some of the ideas of the opening, as well as like some of the pitfalls that people make mistakes with, how white can often go wrong, etc. Kind of give you a taste of the opening in general, and go over some interesting games at different rating levels. So, as I said, we're going to be doing 1 game of mine and 3 from some of my subscribers. So we'll start with my game. I played this, I think, a couple days ago in chess.com Blitz. And the Tartakower goes d5 and either knight c3 or knight d2. It doesn't actually matter which way round. Taking on e4, knight takes e4, knight to f6. Now, some people... Well, there's a few different ways to play this position. You can go knight d7, the Karpov variation, where the idea is that after knight to f3, knight g to f6, knight takes and knight takes, you don't have to double the pawns. I personally don't like the line because white can do very annoying things, like queen to e2, for example, where if we play knight to f6, we get checkmated with knight d6. Now, obviously, like, you wouldn't want to fall for that, but I don't like these lines in general. They're very difficult to play against, so I don't recommend it. So instead of going into all that, we instead go knight to f6, challenging the knight in the center. The knight can retreat, and the knight can even come to g5 and try to go for the alien gambit, which I do have videos on my channel, as well as a whole video on how to refute the alien gambit with the black pieces. But my opponent goes for knight takes f6. We take back with the e-pawn. Taking back with the g-pawn doesn't really make sense because it's going to be way too risky to castle kingside with an open g-file. And after e takes f6, we open up both our bishops. We control the 5th rank very nicely with the c6 and f6 pawns. And we have relatively easy development. My opponent goes knight f3, and this is the first kind of mistake, a positional mistake in my eyes. Now, the computer isn't saying that white is worse by any means, but the knight is misplaced on f3. Really, the way to play this position with white is something like c3, bishop d6, bishop d3, castles, and knight to e2. This is the main line. Now, I actually prefer bishop f5 in this position, which I also have an older video on my channel, going through those lines, because I find this bishop on d3 incredibly annoying, so I'd rather trade it off like this. But the problem with the knight on f3 is that after development continues, normally it continues like bishop d3, castles, castles, and bishop g4. This knight is quite compromised because it can't really move because of the pin. And you don't have a knight to bring over to d2 to defend it and allow the queen to move and break the pin. And if h3, of course, we just retreat. And the engine, says g4 is playable, kicking the bishop back and going rook e1. But of course, white is kind of overextended on the king side. And one of the key ideas in the Tartakower, which I've been realizing more and more recently, is that as the black pieces, because of the way the pawn structure is, where there's a 4-on-3 on the king side, but because of the doubled f-pawns, and in endgames it's not very mobile, but it's also because the kings are on the king side, so they can stop the pawns very easily. The 4 versus 3 majority that white has on the queen side is far more mobile. After c4, d5, white will create a passed pawn in an endgame. So, as the black pieces, you kind of want to avoid going into endgames like that, and particularly trading off the queens in unfavorable circumstances, because the endgames will often be either drawn or worse for you. Very rarely will they be better if the position is materially equal. So, black wants to try to attack white a lot of the time, which is a theme that we will be exploring in this video. It doesn't look like a particularly aggressive opening, but it kind of is. And so, of course, if white advances h3 and g4 like this, well, then we have very clear attacking ideas with f5, h5, building a battery with the queen, bringing the knight into, like, the f4 square, for example, is a very common idea. So this is very good for black. But my opponent starts with knight to f3, which, like I said, is a bit of a mistake. We go bishop to d6. My opponent goes bishop e3, which is a bit of an odd way of going about the position. But what it often indicates is that white is trying to castle queenside. That's what it often indicates. So after castles bishop d3, we don't know which way white is going to castle. And I go bishop to g4 in this position. Not actually the strongest move. Better is knight a6, which is a very clever move, because if white, let's say white castles, then we get knight b4 hitting the bishop, and if the bishop retreats, then bishop f5, let's say c3, well, we can go to c2, which is tactically very nice, but we can even just go to d5, and we're slightly better. And if white takes here, we don't have to play b takes. We have this queen a5 check move, and after c3, queen a6, we have the bishop pair, and we are just much better in this position. So, knight to a6 would have been slightly more accurate. I go bishop g4, my opponent goes queen d2. Again, indicating maybe he'll castle queenside, maybe he'll castle kingside. And this is a theme that you will see a lot if you play the Tartakower, particularly over a certain rating level, where white players will try to be very aggressive and kind of not commit the king to either side of the board too early, which can be very annoying to deal with. However, white has to be careful after the move knight to a6, because knight to b4 could be very, very annoying, right? Because let's say white castles. For a start, we can take on f3, but we can also play knight b4, hitting the bishop. White doesn't want to give up this bishop. Let's say pawn c3. Let's say pawn c3. We'll have to take. Again, we can take on f6, sorry, on f3 if we want, but we can even just try and build a battery. And if h3, take, that's great. The knight can't really retreat out of the position very easily, because after something like this, I don't know, bishop here, rook e1, the white position is very fragile on the king side. We can easily start throwing pawns forwards as well. So my opponent goes h3, asking me the question of what I want to do. In this position, would you take the knight and go for bishop takes, pawn takes, opening up the g file for the white rook? Or would you retreat to h5 and potentially incur the damages of g4, maybe? Also be aware that this knight can be taken, ruining the pawn structure a bit. Or would you retreat the bishop to a square like e6, perhaps discouraging white from castling because a2 could hang? What would you choose? Well, there is a correct answer, and it's bishop takes f3. Now, the reason that bishop h5 isn't that good is, firstly, g4 can be quite scary. Now, the engine isn't too concerned about this, but personally, I would not want to be sleepwalking into a pawn storm on the king side, particularly with the bishops pointed like this against my king. So I wouldn't recommend that. If bishop back to e6, it's an interesting idea, trying to apply pressure to the queen side, because let's say castles, I don't think taking is actually that good. Oh no, it is good. It is. Something like here, or if pawn b3, then white gets mated. So the bishop can't be trapped. So bishop e6 is interesting, but of course white doesn't have to castle kingside. He can ruin the structure and castle kingside, and we have the bishop pair, but white is fine. So bishop takes f3 is the correct answer, but we need to follow it up with an important move. What is that move? Well, it's knight b4. Now, in these structures, white should really have this pawn on c3. So let's say we were to give white an extra tempo, and he were to play c3. Well, here we're still slightly better, but to no means the same degree as we were before. Now, the engine finds this very cool move, queen a5, defending the knight, but more importantly, let's say white plays a move like rook g1, then we can go knight b4, which is really cool. Again, hitting the bishop, and if the bishop moves, the knight can go to d5, because if bishop takes, well, the queen is pinned to the king, and that's game over. So, there we go. Yeah, but after knight b4, again, this pawn should be on c3, stopping the knight from coming here, but my opponent decided to try and be aggressive. My opponent goes rook g1, and he's offering me the bishop. He's offering me the bishop. Should I take the bishop? I mean, it's not a bad move. Taking the bishop isn't bad. After knight takes and queen takes, queen a5, pawn c3, rook fe8. If bishop h6 ideas, we can go pawn g6. But for the time being, the bishop is pinned. We also have bishop f8 defending if we need to. The engine recommends pawn h4, trying to throw the pawn down the board. Rook a8, pawn h5. We can just take that, so that's not a problem. So black is certainly better. But I chose queen a5 instead, which I thought was a very sneaky move. And my opponent falls for it. My opponent falls for it. I laid quite a nice trap. Now, what white has to do in this position is very counterintuitive, because of course he can't castle. If he castles, he's just going to lose. Like, pawn c3, knight d3, queen d3, rook fd8 is what the engine likes. If bishop h6, then we can just go pawn g6, pawn h4, and something like bishop f8, and the white king is kind of compromised. Pawn c5 is on the way as well. This attack isn't too concerning. Obviously, the bishop is hanging. But let's say bishop takes, king takes, pawn h5, pawn a5. We've got an interesting position, but endgames will always favor us since we're up a pawn and the white pawn structure absolutely sucks. But what does queen a5 threaten? Well, after bishop h6, it's knight d3. And that's the problem. My queen is not hanging because this comes with check. That's why the white king needed to move, right? So king f1 and king d1 were what the engine wanted, which is insane. And after c takes, bishop b4. And we don't have to worry about g7, because if rook... No, not rook g6. If rook g7, just king h8. Attack over. The queen can't move. The queen is going to be lost. So my opponent took on g7 with the bishop. I took the queen, king f1. And here the engine likes rook f to e8, but I decided that bishop g5 was the easiest move, although not the best move, because after bishop f6, pawn h6, if pawn h4, for example, I can just move the king. I will happily give up the bishop since I am up a whole queen, although taking isn't the best move. Rook g8 is, which, yeah, makes a lot of sense. But yeah, my opponent resigned in this position. What can we learn from this game? Well, if white's trying to delay castling, we need to be careful. Our king can come under fire, as we saw in this game, and it was a short game. But we also learned the power of getting the knight to b4. We learn the power of the misplaced knight on f3, or the problems that it can cause for the white pieces. And yeah, I'd say that's mainly what we can learn. There's a lot of tactics in the Tartakower like this. Tartakower can often be very tactical. Although it's considered boring a lot of the time, it really depends how you play it. So I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Remember, there's 3 more games to go, all of them coming from my subscribers. And if you are enjoying, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as we move into the second game. So again, it's another Tartakower structure. We are looking at this from the perspective of Snake FPL, again, one of my subs. And his opponent goes knight to f3. After, of course, the normal Tartakower line, take, knight f6, take, and knight to f3. He goes bishop to d6, which is the best move. Bishop to d3, which is the main line. Then black castles. This is very standard. And white goes pawn to h3. Why does white go pawn h3? Well, again, because if he castles, bishop g4. And it's a somewhat similar circumstance to the previous game, although the white king has already committed itself to castling kingside. So, you know, he can't really try to make use of an open g-file anymore. And this is just good for black, you know, pawn h3, bishop h5, pawn c3, knight d7. This is the type of thing that might happen. And black is perfectly fine in this position because this pin is so strong. And if the bishop retreats to e2, white can find himself in a whole lot of trouble because of the alignment of the rook and the bishop with the bishop on e2, which I think I have actually taken advantage of on some previous videos on the channel. I think I actually released a video titled something like 96.6% accuracy in the Tartakower rather recently, which exploited this exact thing. But okay, pawn h3, rook e8 check, bishop e3. Black is already slightly better. Black goes knight to d7. The knight is better on a6 in this line. Again, if bishop takes, what is the move? This is a very common theme. Queen a5 check. This is something you're not necessarily going to consider, but the pawn needs to be on c3 for white, not only to defend the d4 pawn, but also so that this doesn't come with check. So after pawn c3, queen a6, white can't castle. Queen e2 is the best move, offering a queen trade. And then something like pawn f5, looking for pawn f4, is very strong. And again, this pawn f5, pawn f4 idea is a very key idea in the Caro Kann Tartakower, which again, I think we exploited in that video that I previously mentioned. But okay, knight d7 is still fine. The reason knight a6 is better, though, obviously we explored what happens if white takes. But if white castles, for example, then again, knight b4 is an issue. Bishop's under attack. If the bishop retreats, bishop f5, going after c2, and white is in a lot of trouble. So, knight d7, castles, knight f8. And this is a very common idea to reroute the knight via f8, by the way. Knight h2 was a bit of an odd move. Rook e1 would have been far more natural here. But knight h2, bishop c7, a very nice move, preparing queen to d6 to form this battery against the white king. Also, just opening up the queen to the d-file. Queen d2 from white, again, rook e1 makes far more sense, and that's where the rook belongs. Knight to e6. Better would have been queen d6, targeting the knight, which also takes away bishop f4. The f4 square is a very important square in the Tartakower. f4 and f5 are very, very important, either for getting knights to, or for pushing the f-pawn, which is the advantage of doubling the f-pawns, because, well, we already have a pawn on f7. We don't have to worry about creating weaknesses by pushing this f-pawn. So knight e6, slightly inaccurate, but it's fine. Pawn f4 is a big mistake. Big mistake. White is not really the side looking to attack in most Tartakower positions. White should be looking to trade, because endgames favour white typically, or try to play on the queen side where he has a majority and can try and get d5 in at the correct moment. Here, this blunders to knight d4. That's simply winning a pawn. But black doesn't play it. Black goes pawn to b6, which I honestly can't really explain. I mean, I assume trying to fianchetto the bishop, but it's not really necessary. White proceeds with pawn c3, finally getting the pawn to c3, bishop b7, which is, you know, a fine move, a normal move, but again, not really in the spirit of the Tartakower. Normally, you want to leave these pawns as they are. Typically, that's what you want to do. But okay, pawn b6, pawn c3, bishop b7, bishop e4, which is a mistake. Why is that a mistake? Looks like it's stopping c5, because, oh, then you lose the bishop. Well, look at the alignment here, knight d4. Knight d4, and you might be thinking, oh, well, queen takes, and then the queen defends the bishop. Well, no, because then we just take here, bishop takes, rook takes, pawn to c5 is on the way, doubling up is on the way. This knight absolutely sucks, f4 is weak, and black is much better. Knight c5 was played, though, by Snake, which is a cool move, because if this is taken, then the rook can take on e4, and black is slightly better. Although, of course, knight takes d4 would have been the better option. But white retreats the bishop to f3, the knight comes into e4, and after queen d3, of course, if the white bishop takes, then black gets the bishop pair, and c5 is coming regardless, opening up this bishop. Queen d3, pawn c5, supporting this, and it can't be taken because the queen hangs, a very nice move. Somewhat reminds me of a Slav in the way that black is approaching this fianchetto and c5 idea. Knight g4, pawn f5 with tempo, kicking the knight back. Rook b8 is a bit of a strange move, obviously defending the bishop, but it's not really necessary. The engine lights queen h4, which, I mean, I assume the queen wants to come to g3 and apply pressure to f4, which makes sense. But I don't know. I think taking here looks very reasonable for black. Personally, that's maybe what I would play. But this is also one of those positions that can be difficult to decide how to actually convert. You know you're better as the black pieces here, but how do you actually increase the advantage can be a difficult question. But rook b8, not a terrible move. Bishop e4, fe4, hitting the queen. Queen back to d2, cd4, cd4, queen h4. So black goes for this queen h4 idea eventually. Queen d6 is apparently slightly better. I assume looking to bring the rook to d8. So something like here, rook ac1, rook d8, something along these lines looks quite nice. And, you know, with the bishop pair and this passed e-pawn, you know, black is definitely better. But queen h4, rook ac1, rook bc8, defending the bishop, knight g4. Pawn h5 is an interesting move, hitting the knight, but the knight kind of wants to go to e5 anyway. So here, better is like bishop a6, which I don't really see what it does other than hitting the rook. It looks like it's bringing it to a better square, to be honest. Although the engine suggests queen g3, because if bishop f2, then f4 hangs, because the rook is no longer defending it. Pawn h5, knight e5, bishop e5, and that's a mistake, because we have the bishop pair here. The first idea that you should be looking at is, you know, can f6 be played? Can we play f6 to kick the knight away? Because if the knight moves, like to c4, for example, well, I mean, we get rid of the problem piece, and we can continue with our plans of infiltrating the white position. Now, f6 doesn't actually work because of bishop f2, and the queen is trapped. So, there's that. But taking is not really the best option. fe5, rook e6, offering a rook trade along the c-file after take, rook c1. I'm a bit... This seems very natural for white to play, in my opinion, because you just take over the c-file entirely. But white chooses rook f4, hitting the black queen. Queen g3, finally going for this infiltration, where there are so many white pieces which have pressure on them. And bishop f2. Bishop f2. And black is better. Can you see why black is better after bishop f2? It's a very cool move. Queen g2. Sacrificing the queen for pawn e3, discovered check, hitting everything in the white camp. And after king f1, ed2 with tempo on the rook, rook c8 with check, bishop c8, king e2 stopping the promotion. This could boil down to a draw because of the opposite coloured bishops. After something like rook c6, king d2, bishop h3, black is up a pawn. However, with the connected passed pawns on the king side, I think black has very good winning chances. Here, the only move for white to survive is pawn d5. Anything else is not good enough. Let's say, I don't know, pawn a3. After bishop e6, white is barricaded, and the pawns are going to start rolling. With rooks on the board, there's more winning chances. But queen d3, which is a reasonable move, offering a queen trade. White first takes on c8 with check, and then queen b4. Now, what would have happened if white had accepted the trade? Now, obviously, this pawn is very scary, and the engine suggests d5, sacrificing the e5 pawn to go rook d4, which is a difficult idea to really see. I think bishop e3 is far more natural, stopping the progress of the pawn. And this could boil down to a draw, considering the fact that there is equal material here. But queen b4 doesn't work. Rook g6, increasing the pressure. You can see the pressure on h3 and g2 building. Pawn e3 can come at any time. Queen c3, coming back to offer a queen trade. Now, considering how much time white had, if he wanted a queen trade, he probably should have gone for it earlier. Because now there's bishop h3. A very nice move. Because after queen d3, ed3, this can't be taken because of the pin, of course. And now it's a different story. Although it's opposite coloured bishops, white can't stop the pawn. So after e6, bishop e6, white resigns because the pawn is promoting and there's nothing he can do about it. So well played to Snake FPL. Again, one of my subscribers. Very well played. Understanding a lot of the key ideas in the Tartakower. Going for the kingside pressure. Again, queen d6 maybe could have been played earlier. But once the positional weakness of f4 was committed by white, again, there's often tactics like knight d4. But turning the positional pressure up with moves like pawn f5 is definitely a good way to go in this opening. On to the third game. which we are going to be looking at from Lambie's perspective. So again, the exact same opening, the Tartakower. Hopefully you are starting to see some of the running themes of the Tartakower. Knight to f3. Again, so many people go knight to f3, and it's just not that good a move. It really isn't. It's completely unambitious. And you might be saying, okay, I understand this bishop g4 is really difficult for white to deal with, right? But why is the knight that bad? Normally, bishop g4 isn't that big a deal. Well, another reason it's so bad is because of the f-pawn, which just prevents the white from coming forward. Sorry, the white knight from coming forward. On e2, the knight is much better because it can come into squares like f4 or g3 to try and exploit h5 and f5, which, as I mentioned, are very important squares in the Tartakower for both sides. The knight on f3 just has no future. Maybe it can go via h4 to f5. Maybe. But that's about it. Bishop d6, bishop c4, and that's what we want to see. Now, the reason we don't go bishop g4 straight away is because the bishop can just come to e2 and break the pin. What we want to do is start with bishop d6, wait for the bishop to commit itself to d3 or c4, and then go for the bishop g4 idea, right? Obviously, black played rook e8 first, which is perfectly fine. And if the bishop comes to e2, well, then we're obviously not going to go for bishop g4 because there's no pin. We're just going to castle and say, okay, your bishop sucks. It's not doing anything. It's passive, which it is. After something like castles, rook e8, let's say pawn c3, maybe bishop f5, maybe pawn 8, sorry, maybe knight to a6. I think bishop to f5 is more natural, although bishop e6 is also good. And the white position is just quite passive here. But bishop c4, castles, castles, rook e8, rook e1, bishop g4. Rook e8, queen e8, this is all very standard. You know, white has no real advantage here. Obviously, you know, being the white pieces, slight advantage. We also have the doubled f pawns, which is slightly in white's favor. But it's difficult for white to continue this. Knight d7. We're just developing. Pawn h3, bishop h5. The pawn on f6 is also great because it stops this bishop coming to an often natural developing square. And of course, we control the f4 square. So e3 is basically the best square that the dark squared bishop has got for white, which isn't that impressive. It's just a big pawn, really. Pawn g4. White tries to push the bishop back. Pawn c3. Maybe white could have chased it with knight to h4. That would have made slightly more sense, I think. And after something like knight b6, bishop b3, knight d5, knight g6, hg6, maybe queen f3, something like this. This would probably be a bit of a better line for white, although pretty much best case scenario, this is going to be a draw. Which, again, as the black pieces, you can't be mad about that. If white plays well, you're going to get a draw best case, really. That's just the nature of playing with the black pieces. But your opponent isn't stockfish, obviously. So pawn c3, knight b6, black is better, bishop b3. Bishop should have gone to f1 according to the engine, because of how weak the king side is, probably. But pawn a5, chasing the bishop. Now, pawn a5 makes sense. Most of the time, pushing the queenside pawns isn't a good idea, though. Knight d5 is slightly better, going for this trade. And you might be saying, well, why would we do that? Our d5 pawn is a target. It's an isolated pawn. Yes, but also no, because white doesn't have an open d-file to target it. And also, the pawn being on d5 somewhat solves the problem of white's queenside majority. Because previously, the queenside majority could be pushed very easily with pawn c4, pawn d5, creating a passed pawn on the d-file, right? With our pawn on d5, though, well, c4 can't be played. So, in essence, our one pawn is controlling white's two pawns, and obviously these cancel each other out. So, in theory, if we get this structure, as long as d5 can be defended, which it can, then black solves the problem of the queenside majority. Right? So that's another interesting concept. But pawn a5 is reasonable. Pawn a4, I just don't like doing it because it often gets very weak. Knight d5, bishop d5, cd5. So again, how does white actually use his queenside majority? It's unclear. Queen e2. Queen e2 is a mistake. And the reason is because of pawn f5. Utilizing this pawn f5 push, which I have mentioned several times in this video already. Now, why is this so strong? Well, obviously the threat is pawn f4, and the bishop can't take because the queen hangs. So you might be saying, okay, what about rook e1 then? Because now with pawn f4, sure, maybe black is still better, but at least I'm not losing a queen. Which is reasonable. Something like, I don't know, bishop d3, rook e1, maybe king f8, maybe pawn f6, something along those lines. And black is certainly better, but white is not lost, although this bishop really, really sucks. And this pawn could be supported with f6, g5, which isn't unreasonable. Like, I don't know, f6, knight h4, g5, knight f5, maybe we go take and try and play this endgame. Engine says it's a draw, practically black is better. Queen d7 though, which is slightly inaccurate. Sorry, bishop e4. Which again, pawn f5 is the better move. If this is taken, then h3 is weak, and white's structure is very weak because the pawns have been split up. And if this pawn is advanced to g5, we know what happens. White loses the bishop. So this is just good for us. If the queen moves to d2, let's say, then we can take on g4 and apply some good pressure to the white king, which is going to be difficult to deal with. You can see how the pieces are all lining up. But bishop e4, hitting the knight. The knight goes to h4. Queen d7. Engine prefers pawn h5. I can very much forgive white for not finding that. Pawn g5, I think, is a more natural move, which effectively forces the knight to f5. The knight can go back to g2, but that's extremely passive. You know, it can't do anything from there. So after something like knight to f5, this can be taken. Queen d7 now, and the white pawns are very weak. Queen d7 immediately. Pawn f3. And now white can secure a trade, which, again, I think it's far easier to play this with black. The only way white is not worse is if queen b5 is played, offering a queen trade, hitting quite a lot of the black pawns. But white goes bishop f2 instead. Rook e8, hitting the queen. Queen d2, again, queen b5 had to be played. Queen c7, it is better to retreat the bishop and put the queen on d6 or c7, which is what we saw in the previous game. In this one, was it? Yeah, in this one, I think it was, where the bishop was put on c7, but earlier on, where was it? Here, the queen should have come to d6, forming this battery against the white king, which, as I'm saying, is a very common idea in this opening. So here, it could have still been done, even though we're out of the opening phase. The middle game plans often stay the same. Queen c7, though. The bishop leading the charge isn't quite as bad, because if the bishop gets to h2, so what? Although, it does stop pawn f4, and maybe the bishop is going to come to f4, right? Which could be annoying. Knight g6, hg6, forming the pawn cube, which Eric Rosen would be very happy about, I'm sure. Rook e1, queen e1, and queen e7, again. Endgames tend to favour white. Now, I know I said that this pawn majority is harder to use with the pawn on d5. I know I said that. But with the queens off the board, white is always kind of better in these endgames. Whilst we do have a majority on the king side, and we do have the indestructible pawn cube, how are you going to create a passed pawn on the king side? You kind of can't. And as we go on to see, white gets quite a nice position here in the endgame. And this a5 pawn is a big weakness. Again, it's kind of better not to advance the queenside pawns in most positions because they can become quite weak. I'm not going to spend too long on the endgame, although black did an excellent job of defending this. Pawn c5 isn't the best idea because it leaves this pawn on a dark square, which is more vulnerable. Again, like I said, black does an excellent job of playing this endgame, considering he should be worse. g5 is a bit inaccurate, putting all the pawns on dark squares. f5 is better, leaving this bishop with more scope. And again, because there's only dark square bishops left on the board, pawns on light squares are going to be easier to defend. Pawn g5, bishop f8, pawn g6, bishop g7, pawn f5. The bishop chases the pawns, but it can't win any of them. And black is very passive. G4 is a huge blunder. F4 is better, although, of course, this is very, very passive. It is holdable if b4 is played after something like take, king b7. The white king can't really enter the position, and that's the important thing. But g4 is losing because after take, and take, king d7, king e3, king e6, king f4, white is just kind of breaking through. Now, obviously, white is up a pawn as well. Now, if b4, which is the best move, and this is taken and the bishop takes, the a-pawn is very difficult to stop, and if the king tries to come over to stop it, let's say king c6, pawn a6, the king, I don't know, comes to b6, gets given this check, which is brutal, and the pawn can't be stopped. If the king, well, let's say, I don't know, bishop b6, or bishop c5, and if take and take, this can't be taken because the pawn runs, and also this king could be a big problem for the black pawns. But king f4, bishop c7, king e3, king f7, pawn f5 is apparently the only way. If this trade happens and pawn to b4 is played, black can hold according to the engine after king e6. I think it helps that this bishop is stopping the white king from infiltrating. King f7 is losing, but after king g6, king f3, again, b4 had to be played. It's somewhat pedantic and difficult to actually practically find these winning moves, although white does have 15 minutes on the clock. King f3, pawn f5, going for the pawn trade, and black manages to hold the endgame in very nice fashion. We get a repetition of some form eventually, I think. Oh, okay, yeah, we get this position where the black sacrifices his bishop for the pawn, goes king b5, and when the pawn is defended, pawn d4 is played. The white king is too far away to help, and if the white king tries to re-enter the game, the bishop will have to come to e3 to stop the promotion, and everything will liquidate regardless. The game is drawn. So that's how it ends. Again, hopefully a lot learned in that game. Thank you for sending the game in from Lambie. And the final one. Another Tartakower, obviously. We have the same exact way of getting to this position. Same thing. Knight to f3. Again, every single game here, the knight has come to f3. Even though it's wrong, the knight still comes to f3. Bishop d6. Again, waiting for the white bishop to commit itself, which it does. And then after castles, d5. d5. This is a bit different, right? What does d5 do? Well, black gives a check on e8. Very natural. Bishop e3 is the only viable move to block. And then bishop c5. Just saying, okay, what are you going to do about this? The engine wants to castle, allow this, and thinks that if rook takes, then white is okay after queen d4. You can judge that yourself. But knight d4, blocking the bishop scope of this bishop, which just blunders the d5 pawn, forcing the bishop back. And this is obviously a slightly different Tartakower, but it also demonstrates that, you know, when you play an opening in general, you have to be able to adapt, because you're not going to get the main lines every time. Sometimes people will just do really weird stuff, and you've got to be able to adapt to it, which is why I've included this game, because I think it's important in that sense. Now, so far, black has done an excellent job of exploiting white's weird development and the weird pawn d5 push, right? So knight c6, applying pressure to the knight. If this is taken, bc6 secures the d5 pawn, and this pressure remains. Black is up a pawn, probably going to be up 2 pawns very soon. White castles, breaking the pin on the bishop, and then knight d4 is played. Now, the engine suggests bishop d4, and after bishop d4, rook e4, hitting the bishop, and if pawn c3, then we take, because white gets an isolated d-pawn, just like black, and there's no open d-file to try to exploit the d5 pawn. So black is up a clean pawn. After knight d4, bishop d4, black trades all the pieces. and it looks natural because black is up a pawn. But also consider, black just traded off his 2 active pieces. He's just traded them off. And now, d5 is quite weak. d5 is quite weak. And how do you defend? Well, bishop e6, obviously, defending the pawn. Rook ad1, how do you defend? You can't. You can't defend it. It's also a good lesson in isolated queen-pawn positions, which is what this is. In isolated queen-pawn positions, otherwise known as IQP positions, you want to keep pieces on the board. The IQP can be a very weak pawn, which, as we can see, it can be targeted rather easily, and obviously white goes on to apply a lot of pressure to this pawn. We want to keep pieces on the board so we can play around the pawn, right? We can play around the pawn and make different types of threats so that white can't actually spend too much time going after the pawn. For example, if white were to invest all of his resources in going after the pawn, trying to double up, well, then you just lose the knight because the bishop is pinned. So here, white has to castle to break the pin, which he does. And what we can do in this position, again, the engine likes this rook e4 line. I think it's perfectly reasonable not to see this. I think queen b6 is a far more natural move here, just applying more pressure to the knight. Again, white can't invest all his resources into going after the pawn because the knight will hang. If the knight moves, then e3 is just going to be lost. And then even if we lose d5, well, we don't care. Because, I mean, we're winning another pawn. And we can probably save this pawn anyway with moves like bishop e6. Because if bishop e6, rook d8, and that's going to be a big issue. So something like queen b6, pawn c3, defending the knight. Bishop e6 defends the pawn. If knight takes, well, pawn takes, and then we're perfectly happy in this position, right? So in IQP positions, you want to keep pieces on the board and create tactical ideas around the pawn. You don't really want to trade pieces too much, because as we'll see, this pawn is just going to be lost. Now, what black does do is try to create counter threats. Let's say bishop takes in this position. Well, then rook e d8. Again, tactical ideas to try and keep hold of the IQP. So very nice from black. Now, obviously, c4 can be played, but that does hang a2. So technically, black remains a pawn up. And that's what happens in the game. Bishop takes, rook a d8, which, I mean, I personally prefer rook e d8. It just feels more natural because this rook can come to c8, and also with queen a2 and rook a1, a7 can be defended by this rook. But I can forgive black for wanting to put the a rook over here because then the rooks are on the open files. I can forgive that. Pawn c4 defending, queen takes a2, but then rook a1 going after this. So queen b3 only move, rook a7, bishop d5. Now, what should white have played in this position? Well, it's a bit of a weird move. It's queen c3, offering a queen trade, allowing this take and take. And after something like rook b5, the point is that although white is down a pawn, there's 2 sets of rooks on the board, which make it easier to draw. It's just kind of a rule of thumb. But also, black is up an extra pawn on the king side, and it's a doubled f pawn. Again, this kind of demonstrates how endgames can be difficult for black to actually win because of the doubled f pawns, right? If this pawn were on e6, this would be more likely to be potentially winning, although it may well still be a draw. But rook a7 from white, allowing take, take, and take. And with the queen still on the board, it's a bit of a different story. Now, trading the queens is not the best decision for black. Better is rook b5, keeping this pawn on b2, because if queen b3, rook b3, this is very weak. And if the rook tries to defend on b1, this can be taken anyway, because of back rank mate. Very nice. Black trades, rook b5, pawn c4, hitting the rook, rook b4. And if anyone's going to win this, it's going to be black, of course, because black has the extra pawn. But it should be a draw. Pawn c5, rook c8. Now, can this actually be taken? No, because of back rank mate. So rook c1, Pawn g6. Engine prefers king f8, but I think g6 is very natural. Pawn h3, rook b5, king f1, and pawn b6, which is an interesting move. Of course, if this is taken, white loses the rook. This does allow pawn c6, though, which is what white plays. After rook c5, offering a trade, and rook a6 defending, black is better slightly after rook c7. White brings the king, black brings the king, white brings the king, black brings the king, white brings the king, black brings the king, and in time to defend c5. In this position, there's only one move to draw for white. Can you find it? I think it's quite intuitive, personally, and it's just king b5, defending c6. It looks quite obvious, to be fair. And these pieces have to stay around to defend c5 and stop c6 from being pushed. And obviously, the white pieces have to stay around to defend and stop c5 from being pushed. Which means that these pawns are against each other. Now, what happens in the... And that should be a draw, by the way, because it's impossible for black to create a passed pawn because of the doubled f pawns. Again, if this pawn was on e6, different story. Or if he can undouble the pawns in a different manner. So let's say, how can we get black to undouble the pawns? Let me think. F5. Yeah, something like F4, F6, G3, G5, and take would be a terrible mistake for white, because now black can actually create a passed pawn. The engine still thinks that white can defend this with a move like rook a3, because if rook c6, then rook d3 is a problem. But if rook d3 isn't played, let's say, I don't know, the rook goes to c3 to stop the pawn, well then black is completely winning. White is only holding because of tactical reasons. But rook goes, oh my god, the rook goes to b6 though. And after rook c6, rook b7, black has one move to win, according to the engine. And it's king e6, defending f7. Black plays the more natural rook c7, but the problem is, after this trade, the king takes on c5, and again, this 4-on-3 isn't good enough to win for black, because he can't actually create a passed pawn, which is a perennial issue of the Tartakower, which you have to be aware of, which is why I'm trying to drill this in. For those of you still watching, it's maybe like, I don't know, 10%, 5% of the people who actually clicked on this video are still watching at this point, most likely. Guys, in the Tartakower, endgames favor white. You can see this because black is up a pawn in this endgame, and yet it is still drawn. And it's been drawn for a very long time in this endgame, despite being up a whole pawn, because it's a doubled f pawn. Got it? Cool. Okay. Rook b6. Again, rook should have taken on b7, but this allows king e7, king e5 is slightly more active. And as the game goes on, black is up 2 pawns, which is a different story. White wins the pawn, but this is slightly different. Now, I just said that this should be drawn. Now, king e6 is wrong. King f6 is apparently the move. And after the king tries to come and help, the pawn comes to f4, the king goes to e4, the pawn goes to g5. And as moves keep being played, let's say pawn f3, king g6, the king has a clear path into the position. If this king tries to come and stop it, let's say something like this, king h4, king f2. The issue is that g4 is coming. So let's say, well, the white king is going to have to let the black king into g3 eventually. That's something like pawn f5, king f1, pawn g4. White's going to have to give black, undouble black's pawns for him, which is going to leave the white king completely lost after something like f3, gf3, gf3, king f1, and pawn f2, right? Undoubling the pawns is necessary. To be fair, it's not the easiest thing to realize, and the only way that white draws this position is, through my explanation, you should be able to find the move that white missed, which is f4. Why is f4 the move? Because this one pawn is trying to control both of black's pawns, trying to play on the fact that they are doubled. You might be saying, well, can't black just go f6, preparing pawn g5? You're not wrong. You're not wrong. After h4 and g5, for example, if this is taken, and taken, and taken, still white is kind of holding. So let's say, I don't know, pawn g3, pawn g5, and take. That would be losing for white. Because, again, this is now an actually mobile pawn majority. But white doesn't have to take. As to simulate pawn h4, if black takes, well, then again, one pawn is controlling both of black's pawns. So black is up a pawn, but it doesn't actually matter. He can't move. That's the key idea. King d4, again, f4 or g5 are the only moves, because f4 must be stopped so that the pawns can be mobile. f6 is played. King e3 is played. Again, f4 has to be played. g5 can happen, but does g3, which again stops the pawn from undoubling. King e3, king e5, and you might be saying, well, why doesn't f4 work in this position? Well, the engine thinks king d5 is winning, because if pawn g3, pawn h6, pawn h4, king c4, the black king is going to get into the position, because eventually these pawns are going to run out of moves. If pawn h5, gh5, it might look like white is okay, because all of black's pawns are doubled and they're not mobile. But the problem is that the black king is eventually going to get into the position just through muscling the white king out, or shouldering, you might want to call it. So something like this, king h4, king f2, if king back up here. How does black actually win this? Oh, king g2. Oh, of course, yeah. And that's take. This is winning. But pawn g3, pawn g5. Again, f4. If this is taken, white is still losing, but only if the black king shoulders the king out. King d5, king d3. This is a very complicated endgame. Like, pawn h5 is drawn because of pawn h4, and after take, white has the opposition. That's the problem. If we were to triangulate this and give black the opposition, then black would be completely winning because he can shoulder the king out, right? But king e3, king e6, again, this is all just opposition-based stuff here. Black can get sort of an opposition because there's no king to e4, shouldering the white king out, like king d4. Here, white can get the opposition, but after take, that's losing. So king f7, really funny endgame. This is now losing for white. He should take here to ruin the black structure. But g4, fg4, king g4, and I think white resigned in this position. Oh, no. Wait. No, white won because black run out of time. Here, f5 is the most natural move. And after king f3, gf4, king f4, and king f6, the white king can't move on to the g file. So after it retreats and king e5 and king e3 and f4, black gets the opposition, an upper pawn that is going to be winning because the h3 pawn is going to fall eventually. Very interesting endgame. It is useful to understanding the opening in realizing just how hard it can be to convert these endgames because of the black pawn structure having the doubled f pawns, right? If we come back to this position, it's very difficult for black to win this endgame because of his pawn structure. So you do have to understand the ideas of trying to undouble the f pawns, but also opposition, but that's just general endgame knowledge. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot about the Caro Kann Tartakower variation. If you enjoyed this format of video, please let me know in the comments. I want your opinions on this. I need your opinions on this because I'm making these videos for you guys, particularly those of you sticking around to this point in the video, which is probably like 5%. So I need your guys' opinions. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see that very interesting Tartakower game I was referencing earlier, which I uploaded recently, check out the video that appears up here. And if you want to see one of my older guides in the Caro Kann Tartakower, where I go over how to stop the alien gambit after knight g5, which is a line you need to know if you play the Tartakower because white doesn't have to take, then check out the video down there. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in one of those.